Well, hello, New Life Church. Glad to have you joining us for the message this week. Last week, as I do each week, I recorded the message a few days before the weekend, and I ended up changing quite a few things between Thursday and Sunday. So there might be a little bit of repetition for those of you watching the message that also watched it online from last week. You know, early in his football career, Green Bay Packer quarterback Brett Favre just seemed like a really arrogant, pardon the language, he seemed like an arrogant jerk. He was cocky, he was proud, he held his lip out and couldn't be told much because he was a star in a great team. They called him a swashbuckler and a gunslinger. And his character was, to be honest, it was repugnant to me. I couldn't stand him. And it was all about him, right? But then, the amazing thing happened. The last 2 years of his career, I was amazed at how quickly he turned the corner to become such a great guy, filled with character and confidence, honest, a balanced leader for his team. I admired him because somehow in those last 2 years he had gained a backbone for all the right reasons and was deflecting criticism that was just patently unfair to him. In reality, you know this. If you're anything of a football fan, you know Brett Favre didn't change at all between most of his career in those last 2 years. The only thing that changed was he signed with the Minnesota Vikings the last 2 years of his career. And when he did that, my opinion of him got changed because of my biases. You see, I believed that the Vikings were good and upright and the Packers were not. And when he became a Viking, then he became a good guy too. Perspective and bias, boy, they change and affect who we favor and who we disfavor. We're in week 2 of our series on Joseph, from the Old Testament Joseph, the book of Genesis, not Joseph, the father of Jesus. Joseph, family, forgiveness, and redemption. And here's a refresher on the dynamics that we saw last week in Jacob's family history that affected the person that his son, Joseph, would become. So Jacob, the grandson of Abraham and Sarah, who were the great-grandparents of 3 generations down, Joseph, all right? So this is what Jacob's family picks up from the ancestors. Additions that were made courtesy of Abraham and Sarah were adultery and high levels of jealousy. From Grandma Rebecca and Isaac, Joseph could have seen in those two favoritism and deception and jealousy and rivalry and manipulation. From his father Jacob and Jacob's 4, count them, wives, polygamy, male passivity, sexual exploitation, foreign idol worship, ethnic tension, unloved wives. And then from Joseph's own siblings looking around him, he would have seen mass murder, yes. He would have seen family secrets. He would have seen incest. He saw disfavored siblings. He saw outright hatred and rage. Oh God, forgive us for how we can complain about our families. And help us not to excuse ourselves for who we are, knowing that we came from so much better circumstances than Joseph. And we'll see how he turns out. For Joseph, though, one of these factors that we looked at gets put on steroids when he was 17 years old. And we're going to read about it now in Genesis 37, verses 1 through 11. All right? This is what it says. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, who was Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." And his brothers said to him, "Do you intend to rule over us? Will you actually reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. And this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind, but apparently didn't do a whole lot more beyond that. Jacob thought, certainly, that being Dad's favorite was a blessing. But it ends up proving to be a curse, because favoritism is always divisive and toxic in family life. There's no doubt in my mind that the favoritism didn't start with the ornamental robe. It started from the time that Joseph would have been just a little boy, all right in his childhood. And throughout his life, the brothers would have seen that there were regular little indications that baby brother Joseph was the family favorite, the dad's favorite. Joseph probably never got spanked. He never spent time on the timeout stone. He was the one who received probably the more expensive gifts at Christmas, not at Christmas time, at birthdays. Didn't have Christmas back then. One-on-one stories at bedtime, or he got to stay up later than the others, or more frequent invitations to join Dad on walks, or to help with easy chores on the farm. I've always looked at the fallout of Jacob's favoritism and focused on the effect that it had on the brothers. And certainly there was major effect there. But what increasingly concerned me, and it came up more and more as I've been looking at this passage this week and a little bit the previous week, is what effect the favoritism has on Joseph. What effect the favoritism has actually on Jacob. The first thing that I stumbled across as I was studying and meditating and reflecting on it this week and reading about it and all, was in verse 2, where we're told that Joseph was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of the two servant girls, or who had become apparently wives of Joseph, Bilhah and Zilpah. There were 4 brothers from those 2 women. Each of those ladies had 2 sons. So there are 5 of them, counting Joseph, that are out in the field together. And it says that Joseph brought their father a bad report about them. So I've always looked at this and said, Joseph comes back and he tattles on what his brothers did. I think it's different from that. Dumb little brothers do that. They see an older brother doing something, and because they're powerless, because the older brothers, this is the voice of experience, okay? I mean, I did this. I would get, pushed around by my 2 older brothers and all, but one way to get back on them was periodically to tattle on them. But then I asked myself, as I'm looking at these verses, what does that phrase, a bad report, mean? And here's what I discovered. It's the same Hebrew word that is used when the 12 spies come back from scoping out the promised land. Remember, this is when Moses has delivered the Israelites out of Egypt, and they are on their way to the promised land. And before they get there, Moses sends in 12 spies, tell us what it's all about. They come back after many, many weeks, and they say, this is what the land looks like. Okay, so the land was flowing with milk and honey. That is how it has been described, and that is true. Some of the spies came back with a pole between them, one in front of the other one, and between them, hanging from the pole, were massive clusters of grapes. It clearly was a wonderful land that they were going to be occupying. But 10 of them had also seen giants in the land. And so this is what we're told in Numbers 13, verse 32. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. Exact same Hebrew word, a bad report. And what was that report? That verse goes on to say, they said, the land we explored devours those living in it. Well, that's a lie. If it devours people living in it, then nobody should be alive. All the people we saw there are of great size. Here's the problem with this bad report. It isn't true. It's fake news. So as a penalty, Moses canceled their accounts on Twitter. Everywhere else in the Old Testament, that the Hebrew word that in these two instances is translated as bad report, everywhere else in the Old Testament, it's translated along the lines of slander or defamation of character. All right? So here's what I think really it is. I don't think that Joseph is tattling. I think he's exaggerating and lying. It's a bad report, yeah, but really it's a false report. And he's got the perfect opportunity to do this. I mean, just connect some dots here. Joseph is Jacob's favorite. No one could prove Joseph's story to be false. Nobody could say, bad report, Jacob. Joseph isn't telling you the whole story because, well, they could have said that and all, but when Jacob favored Joseph all the time, Jacob would just respond and say, well, I'm going to believe Joseph. He's the one that doesn't seem to lie very much. Okay? He would do this because the other four brothers are already disfavored by Jacob. Joseph knows Dad won't believe them. He could come back with any report practically that he wanted to. And if there wasn't some unbiased, objective person who was a witness to it, then Jacob was likely to believe them. So he knows that all he has to say is, Dad, the four brothers, they're lying again. And Jacob would nod his head. You know, as I was reflecting on this, I came to a realization, I can't do this today, that there's like a whole sermon here that could be shared about the biases that we have, including political biases, and our susceptibility to dismissing the narratives that don't align with our predetermined opinions. Favoritism makes it less important for the person being favored to pursue honesty and integrity because maintaining character doesn't seem to give you a whole lot more benefits. You're already getting benefits that you don't deserve. I think being unfairly favored makes corrosion of the spirit a common casualty. And once deception seems to be profitable, the enemy increases opportunities for us to benefit from future deceptions. Here's what I'm saying. Let's not come to the conclusion that only the 10 brothers had deception get passed down from Jacob, whose name means deceiver, down to the 10 brothers, and somehow off to the side was Joseph, who didn't have that same character quality passed down to him from Jacob. They're all deceivers, including Benjamin, the youngest, eventually. But here's what's potentially dangerous, okay? Jacob's bias makes him blind to the fact that Joseph sins too. He's already blind to the fact of how much a deceiver he is. But because he favors Joseph, it's like he's doubly blind to it. Jacob sees Joseph as being lily white, only he's not. Jacob's biases lead him into the trap of assuming that Jacob is better than he really is, and that the sons were all worse than they truly are. Jacob tastes the bitter fruit of deception, yet again, it's just this pattern over and over and over in his life from the time he himself was a little kid. It doesn't jump a generation and pass over Joseph. He inherited it as well. All right? Verses 3 and 4, okay? Let's move on to them. The first thing that I noticed here is that Jacob appears to love all the boys. It actually says that very, very clearly. He loved his sons, all right? But it says in verse 3 that he loved Joseph more. So the first conclusion I came to regarding this was like more of a surface viewpoint, and that is this. Jacob's mistake is not that he loves Joseph more than he should have. His mistake is that he loved the other sons less than he could have. He was an extremely wealthy man. He could have made all of them these beautiful robes, and all 12 of them get to walk around looking like princes. But that overlooks, that's a surface viewpoint, that overlooks something much more important, and that is this. Jacob gave Joseph something that clearly shouldn't belong to him. And none of the other brothers would have missed the significance of this. Now, specifically, they could see that this type of robe would have gone down to it was a long sleeve robe, would have gone all the way down to the wrists, and then also it was all the way down to ankles. Okay, it went down to that level. Okay, so here's just one thing that pointed out to me in the book by Charles Swindoll, and that is men wearing this type of a robe don't work out in the fields. The brothers are realizing something right now. Joseph has never had to do a whole lot of work, but now, if he's wearing that robe, he never will have to do hard labor like we have to do. So that's one aspect of it, but there's something even deeper than it, okay? And that's brought out by actually a Jewish scholar. From the early 1800s, he was the leading rabbi in all of Great Britain. And he wrote that this robe, based on their research, this robe was the type that was worn by clan rulers, by chieftains, by heads of large extended family households throughout that region, throughout that time frame in the Middle East. It says in those verses, in his old age. That's when Joseph was born to him. In Jacob's old age. What he's doing here is he's nearing the end of his life, and it comes quite a few years later, actually, but he thinks it might be coming now, apparently. He's signaling to all of his sons that Joseph is the heir apparent. That's the big picture. But if you back out even further and try to get even a wider scope of this, okay? Here's the somewhat bigger picture. Decades before all of this takes place, Joseph, you remember, if you're familiar with the story, Joseph stole the birthright and the blessing from his older twin, the firstborn twin, Esau. And remember Esau's response. In Genesis 27, verse 41, this is what we read. Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob. He is setting up Joseph for the very same, to receive the fruits of the very same attitude that Esau had decades earlier. In this ornamental robe story, Jacob again, for a second time, he steals the firstborn rights from someone who should deserve them. This time it's his own son, his own first son, whose name was Reuben. He steals the firstborn rights from Reuben and he hands it to Joseph. He treats the 11th born, that's where Joseph comes into the situation. He treats the 11th born like he is the firstborn, and every brother in line before Joseph is incensed at him. Sometimes when Nancy and I go to a store like Fleet Farm, we'll walk in, and we found this to be particularly true during COVID and then as well around Christmas time. We'll walk in and we've glanced sometimes at the checkout lines, and sometimes they've been very, very long. You know what I'm talking about here if you go to Brainerd as well, all right? And one of us will say, I'll get in line right away, and you go and get the stuff that we need, okay? And so often it's me that will stand in line, and on a few occasions when we've done this, as I'm getting to the front of the line with similarly patient or impatient people behind me, then Nancy will show up with a cart that's full of bird seed and her cosmetics and a bunch of more Harlequin romance novels. And behind us, everyone is groaning inside. We never make eye contact with them because we can already feel their eyes are sending like laser daggers into our backs. Well, into maybe Nancy's back, all right? Or picture it like this, okay? Picture that you spend, so that you learn how to do mountain climbing, okay? And you spend 3 days climbing a mountain in the Himalayan mountains in India. And you are risking your life to become the first person that gets to stand at the summit of a mountain peak that goes up like 27,000 feet, not too much lower than Mount Everest. And when you are almost to the top, when you can see it like 50 yards away, when it seems like you'll be able to be there in about 5 minutes, as you are walking toward it, looking at it, you notice a helicopter come up. And the helicopter lands right at the peak, and out of the helicopter comes the owner of the Dallas Cowboys football team. And he gets to be the first person to stand on the summit, and it's not you. That feeling is like 1/10 of 1% of what the brothers are feeling. The blindness of Jacob to all of this for his sons is just mind-boggling, because certainly he can remember, or he should be able to remember, that as a result of stealing the blessing and the birthright through deceit some 30 years ago from his brother Esau, he nearly lost his life. He had to flee from his family with absolutely no possessions, no wealth. His grandfather Abraham was an extremely wealthy man. Jacob runs away from that and doesn't get to benefit from any of that, all right? He also suffers for 14 plus years working in poverty for a manipulative, lying father-in-law. And then he gets tricked into marrying a woman, that's Leah, a woman that he had no interest in and never grew to love. And then she, in turn, with her jealousy and frustration with her younger sister Rachel, who was beautiful, the one that Jacob loved, she ends up ruining his relationship with the woman that he cherished. And then even when he was returning back to the land that he had left 20, 30 years ago, he still feared retaliation from his brother decades later. He should have remembered all of this, all the consequences that came from stealing the birthright from the one who deserved it. Back to the gift of the robe. It wasn't just that Joseph had nicer clothes and his brothers were walking around wearing jeans that they had gotten from the local Goodwill. Jacob, the dad, is making it clear Joseph gets the firstborn privileges, and the others will be subservient to him. And they realize that their work to build up dad's estate will end up benefiting Joseph more than anyone else. Talk about removing incentive and motivation from 10 boys to work hard on the ranch and the farm any longer. Jacob is shooting himself in the foot. When we understand it with a more comprehensive, larger cultural understanding, then it really changes our perspective on the next verses 5 through 11, that speak about the two dreams that Joseph has, of the brothers' sheaves bowing down to his sheaf out in a field, and then the second dream is how the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars all line up and bow down in front of Joseph. Here's the reality. These dreams are a natural outflow of the gift of the clan leader's robe. There certainly is a divine element to these dreams. There's no question about that, because they do come to pass decades later, which we'll see in the weeks to come. But in some way, those dreams are essentially generated and influenced by Jacob's choice. Jacob sets Joseph up as the leader of the family that everybody is going to line up around, and Joseph's imagination starts going in this direction of sheaves falling down. Now, I think it could have been a factor in those dreams, perhaps not the only factor, but there certainly looks like there's a connection between those two. These dreams in reality are the dreams of the father. They reflect Jacob's hopes for Joseph, which Joseph naively thinks will be nothing but wonderful. He sees power, and he sees wealth, and he sees respect, and he sees others being subservient. What could possibly be bad about that? Who wouldn't want to be excited about dreams like that, all right? The gift of the robe, with its heir apparent implications and the ensuing dreams that seem so closely tied to it, what they do is they set Joseph up as a lightning rod for his brother's anger and their hatred. 2 times in this text, progressively, it says, the brothers hated him all the more. And next week, we'll see where that leads. Now, the question, so what? Well, let me share with you a few suggested reflections or applications or steps to take. And my first one is this. For those of us who are maybe a little bit older, parents of adult children, some of you were almost certainly unfair to the children that you raised, who admittedly pushed the boundaries at the times, and were too inclined to believe that the compliant child wasn't really capable of disobedience or deception. And some of those wounds among your children could very well still be quite raw, because they never got resolved. Perhaps because some of us are just too proud to revisit those in humility and indicate that we were wrong and that we showed favoritism that was not warranted. And I would venture to say this, some of you watching this, look at your children and you you lament the spiritual condition of your children's hearts, when it's very likely that the favoritism that they observed or experienced growing up has played a role in their relationship with God or in their lack of relationship with God. I wonder this: what spiritual ground could be recovered if every Christian parent of an adult child that experienced favoritism in the family upbringing that they had, if every Christian parent humbly admitted to those children, even years, decades later, that they were wrong and that they were genuinely sorry, I think the healing that could take place in our churches could be incredible. Second suggestion is this: how many adults feel that their parents displayed a pattern of favoritism when they were young? I'd guess a significant percentage of those watching, those hearing this message. Whether your parents are alive or not today, you can make the decision to forgive them today. And we can do so because at the cross, God the Father showed favorable treatment to guilty me, guilty you. And he allowed innocent Jesus to be punished instead. If you've received grace like that, by all means, we should be able to extend grace to others. Third reflection is this: parents whose kids are still at home, all of you, listen to this quote that came from Jeffrey Kluger, not necessarily a Christian author. He said this: one of the worst kept secrets of family life is that every parent has a preferred son or daughter. Now, I think might be a slight exaggeration. I think there's probably going to be some exceptions to that rule, but it's probably much closer to the truth than we'd like to admit. So I challenge you, parents, to have the humility to go to your spouse or to go to a close family member or a friend and ask whether this might be true in your life. For the sake of your kids, I'd almost like to beg you to do this. Because if you naively think that you are not capable of favoritism, and I know it was evident in those years when I was a parent at times, if you think that you aren't capable of that, and if you are wrong, you risk emotionally handicapping and damaging every child, the one favored and the ones unfavored. And you risk that it would get passed down for generations to come. Joseph received the fruit of favoritism that started at least 2 generations up. My guess is this: if you do that, it's the person that you're going to see that might be favored is likely going to be either a child that's easy to raise or a child that shares some of the same interests and passions and activities that you enjoy. Remember our potential to be biased and hold yourself accountable with some other person. And then my last challenge to you is simply this: let's not project our dreams onto our children, particularly if they are connected with your past unfulfilled dreams or unrealized goals. That is a burden far too heavy for any child to carry. Let's bow for a word of prayer. In every church, I believe, God, there is a massive amount of pain and hurt that comes from parents who made the poor choices, naively so, ignorantly so. They had kids that were easy to raise and they got the favored treatment. They had kids whose passions aligned with theirs, and they got the better Christmas presents, and that hurt lingers on for years and years and decades and gets passed on from generation to generation, including for some who are watching today. And God, I pray that we would look and we would say, wow, just as Jesus experienced unfavorable treatment from God so that forgiveness could take place and that we could receive that grace, God, that I pray that we would be able to extend that grace to others. Give humility to those who are watching right now, God, who have adult children that 20 years ago, 40 years ago, maybe even 60 years ago, were treated unfavorably and who've carried that hurt for far too long, and it has affected their relationship with their Heavenly Father. May we be willing to go back and communicate our sorrow over what we did wrong. Perhaps sparking them to renew their relationship with you that they walked away from years ago. Help parents who are watching right now, God, to be careful that they don't favor their children unfairly. And help parents right now, God, not to take their unfulfilled dreams and to impose them on their child. That's my desire. Thank you for loving us way better than we deserve. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful week. God bless you all.